bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the July 7th, 2026 episode. As our audience watching on YouTube can see, my guest this week is my partner, Thomas Stagg. And I'm really excited to have Thomas joining us on the show today because we have a new tool that we at Novogradac are rolling out, and Thomas is here to discuss that tool. Now, today's podcast is the next episode of our So You Want to Be a LIHTC Developer series. In this series, we've been covering the fundamentals of affordable housing development, from finding opportunities to structuring and financing successful apartment transactions. Now, today, we're talking about the importance that location plays in determining how much tax credit equity a given development can generate. All real estate developers know that every development site has advantages and disadvantages, hence the old adage, location, location, location. In developing affordable rental housing, that plays out by allowing some sites to have the advantage of being able to qualify for a 30% basis boost. Now, for those that are less informed, you might be thinking, why do I care about a 30% basis boost? Why does that mean something to me? And those that are informed about the law for the tax credit know that a 30% basis boost translates into the potential of generating 30% more tax credit equity. Obviously, that can easily be the difference in many developments between feasibility and lack of feasibility. Today, we're going to discuss the three types of basis boosts. And now know that there is tax legislation that expand the eligibility of other areas for basis boosts. But for now, the statute provides that qualified census tracts are eligible for the boost. Difficult development areas are eligible for the boost. So one is QCTs or qualified census tracts, two, development areas or DDAs, and third, and this only applies for 9% for allocated long-term tax credit developments, there's a 30% basis boost that's available at the discretion of credit allocating agencies. We'll discuss all three, but we're really going to focus on QCTs because that's the tool, the QCT Estimator tool that Novogradac is rolling out. This tool will help developers evaluate whether a census tract is likely to be treated as a QCT or qualify as a QCT later in the year. As I noted earlier, joining me today is my partner, Thomas Stagg. Thomas works closely with affordable housing developers, helping them evaluate project feasibility, structure transactions, and navigate changing program requirements. I'll let him share more about the services he provides. We do have a lot to talk about today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Thomas, welcome to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be back.
So please share a few of the many multitude of services that you provide to Novogradac clients. I know you can't be exhaustive and you've been on many times before, so you're no stranger to most of our audience.
Yeah, well, since this is So You Want to Be a Developer series, I'll mention that I work with a lot of developers doing exactly this, helping them understand if a project's feasible, helping them navigate the state agency requirements for an application, helping them just understand how tax credits work, and obviously helping them work through that structuring until they get a project financed. And then I want to come in and do your final cost certification, your annual audits, and be your problem-solving partner on your projects.
Great. Thank you for that. Now, before we dive into QCT specifically, I want to just start with a refresher, or for those that are new to looking at tax credit, a 101 about the importance of basis boosts. We know that long-term tax credits generate tax credit equity, that they can incentivize corporations and syndicators to invest in a development or to get the long-term tax credits and the tax losses. The large portion of their investments tied to the tax credits. So if you have more tax credits, then you're going to generate on average more equity. Those tax credits are determined based upon your eligible basis. It's a function of the eligible basis, the portion of the property rented to long-term tenants, create your qualified basis, and that is multiplied by a percentage of 9 or 4 in order to generate the tax credits for the development. Technically, the way the basis boost works is you're deemed to have 30% more basis. And by being deemed to have 30% more basis, you're eligible for 30% more in tax credits. As such, you could generate up to 30% more in tax equity. I will say, I talk about you're eligible for, not that you will get. Because I do want to make sure that the audience knows that at the end of the day, the state allocating agency, I should say the credit allocation agency, which is normally at the state level, but not always, the state has to go through and determine how many tax credits you need to be financially feasible. So you're not, quote, over subsidized. So when we talk through all of this, it's all about eligibility for more tax credits, but you only get those tax credits needed for financial feasibility. So Thomas, with that as an introduction, what more should developers know at a general level about basis boosts?
Yeah, well, I'm going to comment that it's not very often we see projects that have too much in credits for what they're trying to do. Usually it's the opposite.
That is true.
You're absolutely right that states are required to monitor for that and make sure that projects are not receiving more credits than they need. But when I think about basis boosts, I think basis boosts are to encourage specific developer behavior, which in this case is to build in areas where, for various reasons that we're going to talk about later throughout the discussion, it'd be difficult to build affordable housing. So in order to overcome these hurdles, projects that are built in these areas have this increase in eligible basis to account for these difficulties that they'll face in building in these areas. And that boost can significantly increase, as you mentioned multiple times already, the amount of equity that your project receives to help close the financing gap to encourage people to build in these areas that are either difficult to develop in for various reasons or have this high concentration of poverty that also makes it hard for projects to be feasible in.
Thank you for that. That's a good overview. I appreciate you pointing out that every one of these rules in Section 42 and more broadly the tax code, there's a purpose behind it. I always want to know the purpose behind it because it makes it easier for me to understand how the rule works and operates, knowing what the purpose is. So I mentioned in the introduction, there's 3 categories currently in the statute that would enable a given location to be a property being built or renovated on a given location eligible for the basis boost. And that's qualified census tracts, number 1, difficult development areas, number 2, and state designated basis boosts. Please walk through for our audience in a little bit more detail the distinctions between these 3 categories.
Yeah, first I'm going to group the qualified census tract and difficult development areas into kind of one bucket, and that's geographically based. So if you're in an area that has this designation, you qualify for this boost. So qualified census tract first, what is a qualified census tract? What makes something qualified? In a qualified census tract, you have a high concentration of poverty in the area. And we'll talk in a second about the exact calculation. But when you're thinking of qualified census tract, you think of something with a high concentration of poverty. It's in the name, but I should point out that these are designated at the census tract level. And so each census tract, so when we look at the census tract list, that's a long, long Excel document. And thankfully it's in Excel now. It used to be in PDF. We'd have to do a lot of manipulation to get a nice clean list of the census tracts, but it is on the tract level. So fairly small geographic area. Then we have difficult developed areas. These are areas where the construction cost is high compared to the rents that can be charged in these areas. So it's difficult to develop in these areas because construction costs are so high. And this is done for metro areas on a zip code level, but we're going to be a little bit more precise here. It's actually done on a zip code tabulation area, which is a ZICTA. And why that's important is zip codes change actually quite often to balance the number of people are living in a zip code to make it easier for the post office to process your mail. But what a ZICTA does is it takes your zip codes and locks those in for a 10-year period. So a ZICTA stays steady for 10 years, whereas the zip code might be changing. I know we're getting a little off tangent here, but if you are looking at a difficult developed area in a metro area, you need to make sure you understand what your ZICTA is and not just necessarily your zip code. In non-metro areas, it's based on the entire county. So a county is either a DDA or not. And again, those are areas that have high construction costs, and so they're difficult to develop affordable housing in. And then the third one is the state designated boost. And we can't say this enough. This is only available to 9% projects. And so 9% projects, when you apply with your state agency will have the qualified allocation plan. And in there, they'll generally outline how you qualify for the state designated boost. We did a quick survey of a bunch of QAPs in preparation for this, and I saw that basically it falls into 3 buckets. Some states say, just apply and shows that you have it, that you need this for financial feasibility and you're qualified for it. So if you can show that, hey, without this 30% boost, we have a gap here that needs to be filled. Then there are states that say, that's great, but we're going to give it for specific geographic criteria. So if you're on tribal land, we think that's going to be difficult to develop there, so you automatically qualify it. Or for a disaster area, we've even saw some states who have in opportunity zone areas to encourage using that incentive that you could qualify for the state discretionary boost. So we have the geographic based areas. We have some states that are doing this based on housing type. So if you're a special needs project, the state agency will say, well, those are more difficult to develop, and often you need more equity to make those deals work because you can charge less rent on the special needs units. So you're going to qualify for it. Or if you're doing enhanced requirements, that might trigger it. Also, green development, sometimes if you meet certain standards, you can qualify for the 30% boost. So when we looked at state agencies, that's why they're giving them out. But it all goes back to this initial point that you need this boost for financial feasibility, and then the state will give it to you. And I guess, as we talked about earlier, there might be some states who actually say no projects in our state need this because we can develop. So I don't want you to think that every state has a clear policy on this and every state is given out for these specific reasons we talked about. Obviously, you need to understand how your state is handling this boost. And then the other really important thing here, one more point, Mike, is that it's not additive. If you're in a QCT and a state designated area, you don't get a 60% boost. And if you're in a DDA2, you don't suddenly get a 90% boost, although you can't really be in a QCT and DDA. They don't overlap too much.
No, I appreciate you pointing that out about doubling, because that's one of those things where we've been doing this for so long, you don't even think of that as a question. But obviously there are renewable energy credits and things like that. There are designations like this that are additive. So I appreciate you pointing that out. How often do these areas change?
Yeah, so the areas are updated every year. And there's some areas that have been a DDA. I don't know the exact stats or a specific area that probably are DDA basically for life because of the characteristics. We would hope that you wouldn't be a QCT for life because we'd hope that developments, et cetera, would help improve the poverty levels in your area and it would improve. But I'm sure there are areas that have been QCTs for decades as well. They are updated each year. The math is done each year. And so when I went back and looked at the changes from 25 to 26, it was very interesting in the small area DDAs. So those are the metro DDAs. We call them small area because they're on zip codes, not county. But for the metro DDAs, 20% of the DDAs dropped off and 20% new DDAs were added. So that's a pretty good churn rate. Over 5 years, it's 100% turnover. I know it doesn't quite work exactly like that. And then the non-metro had an even higher churn rate. 42% of areas were lost and 30% were gained. Now, our astute readers might know that DDAs are designated till 20% of the population is covered. So they're like, how did we lose 42% of areas and gain 30? It has to do with the geographic or the population of the areas that were gained and lost. And so the areas that were lost had smaller population, the areas that were gained had larger population. But DDAs are interesting because we're always going to cover that same 20% of the population. QCTs are a little more interesting because we don't have this hard population cap. There are some population caps that we'll talk about in a second, but Qualified Census Tract, 15% of the areas lost their designation, but only 8.5 were picked up. And so that is a true loss in the sense that we don't have this absolute 20% of the population is always covered. It's just areas that qualify. So there are less areas that qualified in 26 than in 25.
Before we move on, is there anything else you wanted to say about distinctions between DDAs and QCTs? We'll come back to QCTs in more detail. Anything else you wanted to say now about that, or should we move on?
No, I think we're good to move on.
Great. And in order to be comprehensive, I do want you to say a brief word about community service facilities and the significance of QCT community service facilities. Maybe we'll have you back for a fuller podcast on community service facilities. For most developments, notion of being in a QCT to get some of the benefits for financing community service facilities isn't that relevant. But as you and I talked about in prior for the podcast, as we both know, when it's important, it's really important or can be really important. So please explain to the audience what I'm hinting at here.
Yeah. So you may have heard the term community service facility before, and this is a facility that benefits the larger community. And so it can be in your tax credit project and non-residents can use it. And they can even pay for services inside this community service facility with some caveats that those services need to be affordable, et cetera. But it really opens up what you can do with your space to benefit the larger community. And if you're in a qualified census tract, these costs, subject to certain restriction or limitations, I should say, that we won't get too far into here, can be included in basis. So we've worked on projects where we've had a health clinic in the project, and this was going to be a great benefit to the residents. But also, since it was in a qualified census tract, we were able to include those costs in eligible basis. So the tax credit equity was able to help finance the cost of that community service facility. So we've seen health clinics, we've seen resident service outreach centers, we've seen childcare centers, educational centers, a lot of great uses. I even believe I've seen one that had a community gym built in it as a community service facility. And so it really has to just be something you can show will benefit the larger community. But if you can do that, you can really bring in this additional equity to your project and benefit the residents, not just of your project, but the larger community.
And of course, the opposite aspect of that is if you aren't in a QCT, then you aren't able to use LIHTC equity for that. And many times the LIHTC developments would like to benefit from such a facility. So that can be challenging to structure if you're not at a QCT.
Yeah. So this conversation always starts with somebody calling me, Thomas, the city wants me to build this on my project. They want me to do this. And my first question is always, are you in a qualified census tract? Because that changes the whole tone of the conversation and where we're going. If not, then we have to make it as a common area. So I don't want people to think we can't include common, but then we're really restricted on who can use it, what we can do, and what services we can charge for in it. Whereas this opens it up and allows us to be much more expansive. And it's interesting that it's only in a qualified census tract, which I think makes sense since the qualified census tract is the area of poverty. And so we're trying to have a bigger benefit to the community, whereas the DDA might already have these amenities elsewhere in the community.
So I do want to go down and spend more time on the QCTs, obviously, and then have you talk about the estimator tool, which I think is going to be really valuable for developer, already is proving to be real valuable. But at a really high level, when you think about the fact that a QCT or DDA makes you eligible for up to 30% more in tax credits, thus tax equity, if that was the only driver, you would think all LIHTC developments would be in QCTs and DDAs, or at least in allocating agency designated 9% area. But that's obviously not the case. And there's a multitude of reasons why developments occur outside of QCTs and DDAs. But in the sense of completeness, if you could just share some of the many reasons why this isn't the end all be all. Obviously, for a given transaction, it can be the end all be all, but for the broader development community, it isn't.
Yeah. Well, I always laugh and say, Mike, if you want to pay me 30% more, obviously I'll take it, right?
Yeah.
Most people would say, yes, I want 30% more. But there's a lot that goes into considering a project, right? So as you mentioned, the start location. There might be certain location factors that make a project outside of a DDA attractive. One thing that we talked about is sometimes a city might be donating the land, or you might have cheaper land outside of a QCT or DDA, or I should just say out of a boost area. And so the deal becomes financially feasible even with less credits because you're paying less for that land. On 9% projects, we see a lot of projects end up outside of QCT or DDA because the credits are usually capped. So you're already getting the max amount of credits that a project qualifies for. And so the additional basis doesn't really lead to more credits. And then obviously there's certain things, every state has that qualified allocation plan, right? And that really drives a lot of this. And so states might have policies that make it so that areas outside of a QCT or DDA are more attractive. And that can be location points, right? Close to transit, close to schools. One interesting one in California, for example, on their 4% competition, you were able to qualify for an extra point if you're in what was called a highest or high resource area. And that was never going to overlap. I shouldn't say never because never's never, but it generally would not overlap with a QCT. And so if you're in a QCT, it would have been very hard to qualify for the 4% credits in California for a while till they made some changes to allow more projects. And so I think it just gets back to, you need to make sure the deal makes sense. And then the QCT or DDA can be the sweetener. It's a very nice sweetener. It's probably a little more than just a sweetener, but obviously the deal has to make sense first.
No, thank you for that. There's so many sort of other reasons, not the
Yeah.
least of which would also be, is this other area have either local financing available, other local funding sources, things like that? What are the relative area median gross income levels based upon the rental income population, the income population you're intending to serve, so on and so forth. So it's clearly a significant, like you said, more than a sweetener, but it doesn't mean all the developments will be or are in these areas. I love asking guests about common mistakes. And I was going to say common mistakes newer developers make when come to basis boosts, but dare I say some experienced developers? And we were planning for this. Usually you get caught in at the beginning of a horror story and you're trying to change the ending.
Yeah, right.
So please share some of the common mistakes or mistake that you see with respect to basis boosts.
Yeah. So we've talked about that they're updated on an annual basis. And I think some people, maybe because they're not new developers and they've been developing for a long time and it used to be different, but they don't realize that both DDAs and QCTs change every year. Or maybe they're coming from opportunity zones and think that it's a stagnant designation. As we mentioned above, they change every year and it's at least a 20% turnover every year. And so we have developers who aren't paying attention to that. And so they bought it when it was in a qualified census tract. 2 years later, they have all their entitlements, they're ready to apply, and suddenly it's not. And I say bought it, and I should say they put it under contract often, right? We have a contract or an option on land while we're working through this, but they've locked in on this piece of land and then they don't realize that it's lost its designation. And we'll talk later about some steps we can do to preserve it, but they haven't done the steps to preserve it. And that's really the biggest horror story. Occasionally, we do actually see this work out good. We had projects who have applied but were not issued bonds yet. And then they got moved into a qualified census tract or a DDA. And now suddenly their project can qualify for 30% more in credits. Of course, in that case, that's when you have to have the discussion with the state agency, because the state agency might say, well, you've submitted an application without it that shows you're financially feasible. Now you're getting 30% more. Are you oversourced? And so you should be having that discussion with the state agency as to why you're not. Do you have deferred developer fee? Do you have GP contributions? Do you have cost overruns? Who's ever heard of that happening? And so there's all kinds of different ways. But I think the key is just understanding that these are not static. There's certain things you need to be monitoring and aware of. And as we'll talk later, steps you need to take to preserve these boosts.
So you noted how for an experienced developer, if they've been around for 20 plus years, they might remember when qualified census tracts weren't changing quite as often as they do now. And some might be thinking to themselves, well, isn't it provided in the statute as to what the qualifications are for a qualified census tract? So I would like to dig now into how QCTs are currently determined by HUD. But HUD goes through the designation process, but in doing that, they're determining the source of the data used to apply what the statute requires. And with that as an introduction, if you could explain the process that HUD uses to determine and designate QCTs.
Yeah, so HUD is going to use income poverty data. In order to be a QCT, you have to meet one of these two criteria. First, at least half the households have income less than or equal to 60% of area median income. And I think sometimes people will hear 60% of area median income when all areas have less than 50% of that because we're at 60%. We're like, no, you're 60% of 50%. I think people forget that area median income is already 50%. And so half of your households are less than 60% of area median income, or you have a poverty rate of greater than or equal to 25%. HUD uses the American Community Survey data and their income limit data to determine AMI for an area, and they run the numbers and calculate if an area qualifies. But what's interesting is there is a cap on how many areas can qualify. And inside an MSA, only 25% of the population can be designated as a QCT, or in a non-metro area, only 20% of the count of the non-MSA part of the state. So you're looking at all the non-MSA parts of the state. And so this ends up being a cap on it. So you might have an area. I know I'm getting ahead to our next question, Mike, but I hope you don't indulge me. It seems like it. You might have an area that would otherwise qualify because they have a poverty rate of 30%, but they don't because of this cap. And I should mention one thing that's interesting about this. These are the standards you have to meet, but it's actually a 3-year look back. So you look back at the previous 3 data years, I'll say, because it's not really 26, 25, 24, because it's always trailing data, right? You look back at the last 3 data years, and you have to have met in 2 of those years. We can look at that data and know, okay, these 2 are meeting in 2 of the 3 years, so we're good. This one, if you have an area that met it in all 3 of the years, then you think, obviously I'm going to meet it next year because I'll have 2 of the 3, even if I don't meet it in this year. But that's where these population caps come into play. And so you have to be a little more dynamic when you're looking at this and understand the population caps. And now it's not a huge number of areas that fall out, but what's interesting is in certain MSAs, it is a large number of areas. Not every MSA bumps against this cap, but those that do tend to have a lot of areas that bump against the cap. So it's very interesting when we look at the data and understand how this cap applies.
Glad you mentioned the cap because you and I both have had clients come to us and they were surprised that a certain tract that are thinking, well, they had to make a mistake. It should be eligible. And then you have to explain some of the other factors that go into the calculation process that makes it not just a simple up or down for a given tract based upon the data. And your point about the 2 of the last 3 years focuses on or helps isolate the fact that HUD can have the overarching rule in the statute, but they have to then implement it and they have to decide what data sources to use and how to implement that designation.
Yeah, and I think HUD was smart in using 2 of the last 3 years. It shows that they're very thoughtful in this, right? Because if you're using just 1 year, bad data from a survey can cause you to fall out when you shouldn't. So looking at it over a longer period helps really make sure we're getting the areas that need it.
And that's where the sort of old timer developers can remember back at the time when it was done basically every 10 years, subject to certain tract designation changes and things of that nature. But as a general matter, QCTs didn't change very often. So now from a developer's perspective, and you've already mentioned you're going to talk about this, and now I think it's the time. A logarithmic tax credit development is obviously developed over multiple years, and a development wouldn't be able to wait and see towards the end of the development placement service or in terms of knowing what his QCT status is. Obviously, the equity investor needs to know if you've got QCT status and when that's locked in. So please explain to the audience at what point in time and how, under current HUD rules, I always like to say under current HUD rules or most recent HUD rules, because it's not as if those rules couldn't change as well, but how can a development lock in its QCT status as the rules stand today?
Could you imagine if you couldn't lock it in, it floated like the old 9%? Because that is still there from place and service. I tell you, December 31st, we'd have a lot of busy building inspectors, but thankfully you can lock it in. So basically, once you receive an allocation of 9% credits, your designation is locked. You apply, you receive your allocation, whatever your status is, that sticks with you. Once you receive that allocation, you're locked in for 9%. For 4%, it's actually when the bonds are issued. And that always seems surprising to people because they're like, why is it bond issuance? Because this is a credit that we're talking about, a 30% boost in our credits. Why isn't it when we receive our 42M letter or something like that? But it's actually when the bonds are issued. Now, what's interesting about this is, let's say that I'm looking to buy land. I know that I'm not going to be able to receive an allocation for potentially a year or maybe longer, or issue my bonds because I have to do all this additional analysis and diligence on my project. So how do I protect myself in that scenario, right? And that's when HUD has said that if you're on the list, you can complete application to either the state tax credit allocating agency if you're a 9% project, or the applicable bond issuer if you're a 4% project. If you submit a complete application to them, and then within 730 days of the date you submit that complete application, you do one of those factors we talked about. You either get an allocation of credits or have your bonds issued. Then your DDA status reverts to what it was when you submitted that complete application, which obviously you'd only do if you were losing your status. And that's why understanding what your status is going to be in the following year is so important because it helps you make decisions about, do I need to submit this complete application? Do I need to get that together?
I appreciate you pointing out and saying a complete application, not an application. You always want to pay a great degree of attention and detail to your application. But I will say that comes to bonds, a 9% transaction, most of the time when you're submitting that application, you're competitive against others and all the rest, and you're pretty hyper-focused on having a very complete application, or else you get bounced in the next round of the rest. On bond issuance, a lot of times that's not quite as tight. So sometimes when you're applying to the bond issuer, you're not necessarily as diligent. And this is all those areas where you want to be really diligent about having a complete application.
Yeah. And on what a complete application means, I'll read you the definition in the Federal Register from HUD first. It says a complete application means that no more than a de minimis clarification of the application is required for the agency to make a decision about the allocation of tax credits or issuance of bonds requesting the application. And if we want to talk horror stories, this is one of those areas where people come to me and they say, well, what is a complete application? And that's the only language I have. So often I say, it's up to you, the state, and the investor as to what makes a complete application. But you make a great point. This isn't write the project name on a piece of paper and say, I need bonds, right? We can be a little looser on an inducement resolution. It's not an inducement resolution. It's a complete application. And so for the state agencies or bond issuers that are listening, you should have a very defined process for this. And you should have a very clear what means a complete application for you. And nowadays, maybe not as much with the 25% test, but if bonds are competitive in your state, I think you need to address what happens if you update the application because you have 730 days to get that issuance. You make small changes for point scoring categories or for other things. Is that changing your complete application? Or is that kind of refining it and retooling it? I don't know what the right answer is there, but it would probably behoove a state agency to have thoughts on that and be communicating with their developer partners.
It's a great point. I appreciate you reading the limited guidance we have from HUD and the importance of the members of our audience that work at allocating agencies, both for the bonds and the issuing agencies, I should say, and then allocating agencies have guidance on that front.
I do remember my additional point on that 730 days. HUD has actually used this tool on occasion to respond to disaster relief or to respond during COVID, and they've extended that 730 days under certain circumstances. So it's important to understand that 730 days, while it's set currently, that can also change, and HUD has used that as a tool to help projects that have faced natural disasters or other things.
And I'll just emphasize that just shows the importance of when the designations do come out, making sure that all that language gets reviewed and nothing's changed. And obviously if it's changed, you're operating under the new changing and all the rest. I want to emphasize the fact that HUD is determining the process. We have to follow that process as determined by HUD. So let's talk now about the tools, the estimator tool. We have a estimator tool that you lead here at Novogradac for income limits, which lots of clients are buying so that they can estimate what the income is likely to be in a given area, subject to variability, and not all areas can be estimated, but large portion can, and so on and so forth. But it gives them a heads up, an early look. This Qualified Census Tract Estimator tool will do the same. So please tell the audience what some of the benefits of the tool are and why we undertook making it available.
Well, as we've talked about, losing or gaining a designation can really change a project's future. And it can change whether or not a certain piece of land is as valuable as you thought it was. And so having this early look at it is super helpful. That's really what started this tool is people came to us and they said, Novogradac, can you let us know what's going to happen next year at the Qualified Census Tracts? Are we going to maintain the area? Are we going to lose it? We start with the same data that HUD uses. We're just doing it earlier than HUD is doing it because HUD has statutory mandated deadlines that they have to release this information. Typically, we're trying to release this information about 6 months earlier than HUD is releasing it. So that gives you a longer window. Right? HUD publishes the list sometimes as late as October. That can give you a very tight window. But if you know before anybody else that your area is going to lose it, you can start working on estimator. Also, if you know earlier than somebody else that an area is going to gain a QCT, or is likely to, I should say, because our data is not 100% accurate, right? There's adjustments and things for split count. I won't go into all the weeds, but it is a little more difficult than just saying 1 minus 2 equals -1. But it can help you understand that maybe this piece of land that I know will be in a QCT 6 months earlier than anybody else, can I be a little more aggressive trying to take this land down? Or it can help you understand your portfolio. If you're doing portfolio planning for the year and you have 2 projects and you're trying to decide which one to use, if you know this one's going to lose its designation, you might choose to prioritize that project over another one. So it's just giving you another piece of information in your toolbox to help you make these earlier informed decisions as to what you want to do with your development pipeline.
So Thomas, you know the question I will ask, would you tell me 6 months early? And I understand that's because you get the HUD income data in April. So let's be 6 months early. How about getting it a year and a half early? It'll have more variability to it. But is that step 2?
Yeah, so that's the next iteration we're looking at, because we have the income limit estimator already. And the key data that's making us wait till April is the HUD income limit data. And so the thought is that in our next iteration, we'll take our estimates of income limits that usually come out in September of the previous year and use that as our baseline for doing our first run of this analysis. So now you're a year in advance. And then 6 months later, when we get the actual HUD numbers, we'll update for that. We have a broad lens a year in advance, and we have a tighter lens 6 months in advance to give us even more flexibility as we're looking at this.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And you hinted at this in terms of the various uses, and we've just rolled it out already, getting many developers and others reaching out to us, both developers, underwriters, and others, to get access to it. It's been great to see the level of interest. How are developers using it in practice?
What I've talked about already is using it as just one more tool in their toolbox to make informed decisions, right? I know it's a small industry and we all kind of share information. We get along very well, but at the end of the day, sometimes you're competing for the same piece of land. And so having this piece of information early, or you're trying to decide even inside your own portfolio, how to prioritize certain projects. If you know it's losing its designation in a year, can you prioritize that project and get it done earlier so that you're at a place where you can submit that complete application and preserve it? Because a lot of times now, to submit an application, you need to have a project that's ready to proceed, usually able to close within 180 days. And so you need to be able to really prioritize that project if you think it's going to lose its designation. So there's using it to make those informed decisions. And I will mention, we've spent this episode talking about QCT estimators. I'm sure people are wondering, well, where's my DDA estimator? And
that was my next question.
Oh, well, I knew I can read your mind, Mike. We've done it enough times. Eventually, I'll learn to pause so you can ask the question. But the DDA estimator is in the work. The issue with the DDA estimator is that HUD has many more adjustments that they apply to the calculation. So it's a little bit harder to get to the same robust level that we want our estimates to be. And so we're still working through that. And the iteration should be coming out hopefully in the next little while. I don't want to put in exact dates, but this year will be out obviously before the DDAs come out from HUD, and the next year we'll be looking to release it on a similar timeline as the QCT. So they'll come out at the same time.
Excellent. Once again, thank you for all of that. We've covered a lot today here on Basis Boosts. Before we bring it to a close, is there anything else you wanted to share with the audience about the new tool or Basis Boost more generally?
I think I might broaden the question and just say, I'm just excited that, Mike, you've given me the kind of the freedom to explore these kind of data sets and see how we can help developers. I think it's just a great addition to the information that we have in the industry, to be able to have this information early, to be able to have income limits early, our operating expense database that we do also. I just love all the information that we're sharing, especially as we get more into kind of machine learning, large language modeling. Having all this additional information just helps us have more informed decision making. So I think it's just a really exciting time in the industry. I know that wasn't exactly your question, but I'm just excited about the products that we're starting to offer and how that's going to benefit developers and the industry at large.
No, I'm really excited too. And we do have a pipeline of other tools that we're working on. So it's exciting to see what's going to come out and what's going to make its way out there over the coming weeks and months and years ahead. And I will encourage the audience, if there are areas where you could really use an earlier look, earlier estimates, please reach out to us, because we do need to evaluate which ones to prioritize over the other ones. So if there's particular areas that would be particularly useful to you to get earlier looks on, please do reach out to Thomas or me. Of course, we'll include a link to reach Thomas in today's show notes, as well as a link to access the QCT Estimator tool. Thank you for joining me today, Thomas. We did cover a lot, and please stay around for the off-mic section, where I'll be asking you to share some thanks, to give a shout out to someone in the industry. But before we go there, for our audience, let me thank you for listening. And if you valued today's episode, I encourage you to subscribe to Tax Credit Tuesday on your favorite podcast platform if you haven't already. Please do also share the episode with colleagues. And as I mentioned earlier, I will have Thomas's contact information, as well as a link to the estimator of Qualified Census Tracts. Please go to our show notes for those additional resources. And as I like to say every week, if you have ideas for future episodes, please send us an email at contact@novoco.com. Okay, now let's turn to our off-mic section, where, as I noted earlier, we use this space to give a shout out to others working in the tax credit and tax incentive communities, to highlight professionals and others who deserve recognition. So Thomas, who would you like to shout out?
Well, keeping with the theme of the 4th of July and 250th birthday of our country, I wanted to give a shout out to actually elected officials who are working hard on behalf of tax credit programs and really to benefit people who are in need of affordable housing. But we've had some great successes over the last few years, the 25% test, and looking back even further, the 4% floor, the expansion of the 9% credits, and even currently the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. A lot of great things are happening with housing right now. And so I want to shout out two of my elected officials who've been so instrumental in this, Maria Cantwell and Del Binney, who have really been champions of the cause. And it makes me proud to be a Washingtonian and to know that they're fighting for what I believe in Washington. That's my shout out here on this day after 4th of July weekend.
Great. Thank you for that. I'll echo your shout out to Senator Cantwell and Congresswoman Del Binney. They've both been great champions for affordable housing and for the low cost of tax credit in particular, along with a host of other members of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. So I appreciate your patriotic shout outs. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.